The ninth interruption came like the crack of a gavel, except it wasn't justice echoing through the chamber. It was Bill Barr's voice, slicing through Jasmine Crockett's words with that familiar smirk painted across his face. He leaned back, exuding the kind of confidence only arrogance could sustain, and cut her off mid-sentence as if her voice was nothing more than background noise. The room shifted. You could feel it in the silence between syllables. Crockett stopped speaking, not because she had been silenced, but because she chose to pause. Her eyes locked onto Barr. Not a glare, not even anger, just a piercing steadiness that said more than any shouted retort could. It was the look of someone who had been underestimated far too many times and was done allowing arrogance to dictate the terms of the conversation. In that pause, the air thickened. Every spectator, every aide, every reporter in the room leaned forward, sensing that something was about to break. And then came the question, not from Crockett, but from the very atmosphere of the moment, a question that seemed to hang above the committee room like a storm cloud. How many times can arrogance try to silence dignity, before dignity finally speaks and ends it all? Barr's grin widened, mistaking silence for surrender. He had interrupted 9 times already, each one a calculated attempt to reassert control, to remind the room of his stature, his power, his audacity to talk over anyone who dared confront him. To him, it was a game of dominance. To everyone else, it was an insult unraveling in real time. Crockett, however, didn't flinch. Her stillness was her weapon. She let the weight of his interruptions gather, one by one, like arrows missing their target, and with each one the audience's anticipation grew. The patience, the composure, the quiet defiance, it all built towards something inevitable. No one in that chamber could have predicted the magnitude of what was about to come. 9 interruptions had been endured, absorbed, and catalogued in silence. But what Barr failed to understand was that silence, in the hands of someone like Jasmine Crockett, isn't weakness, it's strategy. And as she prepared to deliver her response, the entire room braced itself. But no one in that chamber knew. The 10th line would echo across the nation. This hearing was never meant to be just another exchange of words. It was about something deeper, something America has wrestled with for generations. Accountability, transparency, justice. The stakes stretched far beyond a committee room lined with microphones and cameras. They reached into the very heart of whether power could continue to operate unchecked, or whether it would finally be forced to answer to the people. Bill Barr knew the weight of the moment. He had been through hearings before. He had played this game, and in his mind he knew the rules. Dominate the air, overwhelm the questioner, and force the clock to run down. If you never let your opponent finish a thought, you never have to answer the uncomfortable truths hidden in their words. And so, with every interruption, Barr tried to do what he had done countless times before: shift control, redirect attention, and diminish the person sitting across from him. But this time, his opponent was Jasmine Crockett. And Crockett wasn't just asking questions. She was standing on a foundation of patience and precision, watching as arrogance dug its own grave. Every interruption became a pattern, a rhythm of disrespect. He'd cut her off, she'd pause. He'd lean forward, she'd lean back, unshaken. To the untrained eye, it looked like Barr was winning the exchange, asserting dominance. But to those who knew how to listen, to those watching closely, it was clear that Crockett was doing something far more dangerous to Barr's strategy. She was letting him expose himself. There's a special kind of silence that follows arrogance. A silence not born from defeat, but from calculation. Crockett's patience wasn't weakness. It was a choice, a decision to let Barr believe he was in control while the audience saw the truth with their own eyes. They saw the interruptions, the dismissive tones, the smirk that curled with every word. They saw a man so consumed with silencing another that he didn't realize he was amplifying her voice instead. Because here's the reality. When you interrupt someone once, it can look like confidence. Interrupt them twice and it looks like strategy. But interrupt them 9 times, that begins to look like fear. And fear is exactly what was bleeding through Barr's performance. Fear that Crockett's words, if allowed to land, would expose him. Fear that the truth, if spoken in full, would unravel the facade he was trying so desperately to maintain. Crockett, meanwhile, remained steady. She wasn't chasing quick victories. She was waiting for the decisive blow. She knew what millions watching would come to realize, that dignity, when cornered, has a way of fighting back with 10 times the force of arrogance. The tension built with each interruption, and by the ninth, the room itself seemed to lean toward her, begging for the moment when she would finally answer back. What she was about to say wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reckoning. A moment that would take the disrespect hurled her way and transform it into something unforgettable. Barr thought he was silencing Crockett. What he didn't realize was that he was writing the script for his own undoing. And to understand why Barr miscalculated so badly, you need to see the history behind his arrogance. For decades, Bill Barr's name has lingered in the halls of power like a shadow. To his allies, he was a loyal guardian of institutions, a man who could be trusted to shield the powerful from the storms of accountability. But to his critics, he was something else entirely, the quintessential protector of privilege, a figure who treated oversight not as a duty of democracy, but as an inconvenience to be brushed aside. His career was built on a simple philosophy: power protects power, and the public's right to answers always comes last. Barr's reputation wasn't earned in silence. It was crafted through a pattern repeated time and again of dodging hard questions, dismissing critics with a smirk, and treating the very act of accountability like a personal insult. When pressed, he mastered the art of talking past the questioner, of expanding into tangents that devoured time and left little substance behind. And when that didn't work, he would lean on the bluntest tactic of all: interruption. Talking over his challengers was more than a habit, it was his armor. In hearings, on panels, and in interviews, Barr had long discovered that dominance wasn't always about what you said, but about how effectively you could keep others from speaking at all. For years, this strategy worked. Committee rooms often bent under the weight of his interruptions. Journalists lost their threads, and critics walked away frustrated, robbed of their moment. It was arrogance, yes, but it was also calculation. Barr understood that in a world where sound bites dominate, the person who controls the sound controls the story. By cutting others short, by inserting himself again and again, he created an illusion of authority. Each interruption was a performance of power, a reminder that in his mind, his words mattered more than anyone else. And let's be clear, this arrogance didn't grow in a vacuum. Barr's career had long been cushioned by the privileges of the elite. Ivy League degrees, connections to the highest levels of government, the revolving doors of Washington that spin only for the well-connected. These weren't just advantages, they were accelerants. They reinforced the idea that he wasn't just above the fray, he was untouchable. When history questioned him, over controversial decisions, over shielding the presidency from scrutiny, he responded with the same mix of condescension and control. To him, critics weren't partners in democracy. They were irritants. And the more they pressed, the more he interrupted, always pushing back with the quiet arrogance of someone who believed the rules didn't really apply to him. For years, Barr thrived in rooms where interruptions worked, spaces where patience was short, where challengers lacked the stamina to endure, where his status alone intimidated those across from him. He wielded that power the way a fencer wields a blade, not always to strike, but to parry, to deflect, to exhaust the opponent until the fight itself seemed pointless. But this room, the one where Jasmine Crockett sat, was different. Here was not a journalist constrained by time, nor a colleague eager to move on. Here was a woman forged not by elite privilege, but by struggle, community, and the relentless demand for justice. Here was someone who had weathered being dismissed, underestimated, and interrupted her entire life, and had turned those experiences into a strength. And that's where Barr's miscalculation began. He believed his old tactics would work as they always had, that he could talk over Crockett 9 times and walk away smug, believing he had won simply by dominating the airwaves. But what he failed to see was that every interruption was not a demonstration of control. It was a confession of fear. Because arrogance is loudest when it is most fragile. And in his voice, cutting her off again and again, the fragility was unmistakable. Barr had become the embodiment of elite arrogance, a man propped up by privilege, relying on the tired tricks of interruption and dismissal to maintain the illusion of authority. But illusions only work when the audience still believes in them. And as millions watched, belief in Barr's act was crumbling fast. He wasn't just exposing himself as dismissive, he was exposing a larger truth. That the old guard, with all its smug certainty and entitlement, could no longer silence the rising voices determined to be heard. But if Barr represented the old guard, Jasmine Crockett represented something entirely new. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin in the marble halls of Washington. It begins far from the spotlight, in the places where ordinary people fight daily battles just to be heard. She grew up surrounded by the realities of working-class life, where hard work was not a choice but a necessity, and where injustice was not an abstract idea but a constant presence. In those early years, Crockett learned the language of resilience. She watched people she loved struggle against systems stacked against them, and she internalized a truth that would guide her life. If dignity is not defended, it can be stolen. That awareness lit a fire in her, one that carried her through school, through sleepless nights of study, and into the grueling path of law. She did not step into the legal profession because it was easy or glamorous. She stepped into it because she saw law as a tool, imperfect, flawed, but capable of being wielded in the service of justice. Where others saw endless paperwork and statutes, Crockett saw a weapon to fight back against exploitation and inequity. Her early career was marked by battles on behalf of those who rarely had champions. Tenants fighting eviction, workers demanding fair treatment, defendants who couldn't afford the kind of lawyers that privilege buys. Crockett stood with them, often at personal sacrifice. The pay was modest, the hours punishing, and the resistance from entrenched interests relentless. But for her, it was never about the comfort of the fight, it was about the necessity of it. That necessity shaped her reputation. Those who knew her in courtrooms and community meetings began to see a pattern. Crockett was sharp, razor sharp. Her wit cut through pretension, her logic disarmed opponents who thought they could overwhelm her with bluster, and her voice carried the weight of lived experience. She was fearless, not because she never felt fear, but because she never allowed fear to dictate her choices. When she entered politics, that reputation followed her. She did not present herself as someone above the people she represented. She carried the scars and stories of her community with her, walking into the halls of power not as an outsider begging for a seat, but as a fighter demanding space for those who had been excluded for too long. And here lies the heart of why her voice matters. Crockett does not speak from theory, she speaks from struggle. She knows what it feels like to be dismissed, to be interrupted, to be told implicitly and explicitly that her words are less valuable because of who she is. That is why her calm under fire is so powerful, because it is not just composure, it is a lived strategy of survival and triumph. Every time Barr interrupted her, millions of people watching could see in her face not surprise but recognition. She had been here before. Maybe not in this room, maybe not with this man, but in countless conversations, boardrooms, and negotiations where someone believed they could silence her with arrogance. They couldn't then, and they wouldn't now. The sacrifices behind her strength are part of the story too. Public service demands more than policy positions. It demands a willingness to carry the weight of others' hopes while bearing the brunt of attacks. Crockett made that choice, knowing the toll it would take, because the alternative, silence, was never acceptable. Every late night, every insult hurled, every attempt to marginalize her only reinforced the truth that she belonged in these rooms not as a token, but as a force. This was not just another politician reading from talking points. This was someone forged in struggle, someone who understood that dignity is not granted by the powerful but claimed by the persistent, someone who refused to let arrogance write the story unchallenged. That is what makes her confrontation with Barr so resonant, because when she sat across from him, she was not just Jasmine Crockett, the congresswoman. She was Jasmine Crockett, the daughter of working-class sacrifice, the attorney who fought for the voiceless, the woman who had endured a lifetime of being underestimated and had turned it into a weapon of grace and steel. So when Barr leaned in, cutting her off again and again with that smirk of entitlement, Crockett didn't just hear her own voice being dismissed. She heard echoes of every voice that had ever been talked over, every story erased by those who thought power gave them the right to interrupt truth. And she knew she carried all of them with her in that moment. And so, when Barr tried to drown her out, he underestimated the storm he was about to unleash. The exchange unfolded like a slow-motion prize fight. Barr struck first, his words slicing into Crockett's sentence before it even reached its point. He raised his voice, not to clarify but to dominate. His smirk returned, the practiced expression of a man who believed control could be measured in decibels. Crockett stopped. She inhaled, steadied herself, and calmly reclaimed the floor. Her tone was firm, deliberate, and unshaken. But before her thought could crystallize, Barr lunged again. Another interruption, another jab, another attempt to knock her rhythm off balance. The pattern repeated. She pressed forward, he cut her off. She asked direct questions, he ducked, weaving into detours and half-answers that bled the clock. Each time she adjusted, finding her footing, only to be met with another verbal swing. It was less a conversation than a contest of endurance, like watching a boxer circle the ring, enduring hit after hit while searching for the right opening. The tension inside the chamber thickened. Aides shuffled uncomfortably in their chairs. Reporters scribbled notes with sharp, impatient strokes. Even the audience at home, millions watching through screens, felt their frustration rising. How much more could she take? How many times could arrogance smother a voice before that voice rose in defiance? Barr pressed harder, sensing advantage. He leaned into his role, growing more aggressive with each interruption, as though volume alone could grant him victory. His tactic was simple. If he kept jabbing, kept talking over her, eventually she would falter. That had been the outcome so many times before. Others had wilted under his constant barrage, letting the interruptions stack until their arguments dissolved into silence. But Crockett was different. Each interruption didn't weaken her, it sharpened her. You could see it in her eyes, steady and unwavering, like a fighter absorbing punishment not out of weakness, but because they knew the right moment was coming. Her patience was not submission, it was strategy. She was biding her time, letting Barr expend his energy, waiting for him to expose himself fully before delivering the counterpunch that would land. The ninth interruption came and the tension snapped taut. Crockett's words were once again severed mid-sentence, and Barr's smirk widened as if he had won the exchange. He leaned back, confident that dominance alone would carry him through. But the room didn't share his confidence. The room felt the electricity building, the sense that this pattern could not go on forever without a break, without a reversal, without an explosion. Every jab had carried him closer not to victory, but to vulnerability. The interruptions that once projected control now revealed desperation. And while Barr could not see it, everyone else could. He was cornering himself. Crockett's composure became its own form of power. Each pause, each calm reset of her voice, carried more weight than his bluster. It was the silence of someone who knew the knockout was coming. She didn't need to fight on his terms. She was preparing to end the fight on hers. The air was electric, thick with expectation. Observers shifted forward in their seats. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. Even those who had doubted her patience began to recognize what was happening. Barr was overplaying his hand, and Crockett was about to cash it in. The interruptions had built to a crescendo, a rhythm of arrogance so relentless it begged for a breaking point. And in that moment, with the stage set and the nation watching, The question that hung in the air from the beginning returned with new urgency. How much more could she take? The answer came on the 10th interruption, and it would change everything. The 10th interruption was different. It wasn't louder than the others, nor more aggressive, but it carried with it a kind of inevitability, as though Barr couldn't stop himself. He cut in with the same smirk, the same swagger, confident that this time, like all the others, he could talk over Jasmine Crockett and bury her words under the weight of his voice. But that was the moment she had been waiting for. Crockett didn't snap back. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she leaned forward, steady as stone, her eyes fixed on Barr with unflinching precision. The room stilled. Even the clicking of reporters' keyboards seemed to pause, as if everyone sensed that something irreversible was about to happen. Her voice came calm, measured, each syllable deliberate. And then, with surgical clarity, she delivered the line that would slice through the arrogance like a blade through silk. "Mr. Barr, if you're interrupting me for the 10th time, it must be because you're terrified of what I'm about to say." The words hung in the air, unshaken, undeniable. For the first time in that entire exchange, the silence belonged not to Barr's domination, but to Crockett's command. Barr's smirk faltered. His mouth opened slightly, but no words followed. It was as if she had pulled the curtain back, exposing not just his tactic but his fear. She had named it, framed it, and turned it into evidence against him, all in a single sentence. The reaction rippled outward. Some gasped quietly, others exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. The hearing room had become a theater, and everyone knew they had just witnessed the turning point. What made her line so devastating was not just its wit, but its truth. She hadn't merely called him rude, she had called him afraid. And in politics, in power, there is no greater wound than fear revealed. Word by word, the power of that line unraveled Barr's entire strategy. "Mr. Barr," she began with respect, the formal address that set the tone. No insult, no pettiness, just a precise acknowledgement of who he was. It stripped him of the excuse to dismiss her as emotional or disrespectful. "If you're interrupting me," she named the act directly. No ambiguity, no deflection. She forced him and everyone watching to confront the undeniable pattern that had unfolded before their eyes. For the 10th time, she counted it. She didn't generalize or exaggerate, she put a number to it. 10. The sheer accumulation transformed what could have been dismissed as coincidence into undeniable evidence of his behavior. "It must be because you're terrified." Here was the strike. Not annoyed, not flustered, terrified. She reached past the arrogance and exposed what was hiding beneath. Fear. Fear of her words, fear of her truth, fear of the power she carried in her composure. "Of what I'm about to say." With that, she turned the tables. The interruptions weren't signs of her weakness, they were proof of her strength. The very thing Barr had tried to bury became the very thing he elevated. He was terrified of her voice, and now the whole nation knew it. The silence that followed was cinematic. Reporters froze, eyes wide, pens suspended in midair. Aides behind the dais shifted uneasily, unsure whether to look at Barr or Crockett. Even Barr himself seemed suspended in shock, his usual arsenal of words abandoned for a moment of speechlessness. And in that silence, Crockett sat poised, her expression calm, almost serene. It was the silence of victory, the silence of someone who had just claimed the high ground and knew it. The air shifted. It was no longer Barr's interruptions filling the room, but Crockett's authority. Every ounce of dignity she had held in reserve poured into that moment, eclipsing his arrogance entirely. For those watching at home, the effect was immediate. Social feeds lit up with reactions. She ended him right there. "That's how you handle arrogance, with dignity and truth." Clips of the exchange began spreading within minutes, captions emblazoned with Crockett's line, the words already immortalized as a rallying cry. What made it so powerful wasn't just that she silenced Barr. It was that she did so without ever raising her voice. She didn't meet arrogance with arrogance. She met it with composure, intelligence, and the kind of steady power that cuts deeper than any insult. In that instant, the battle was decided. Barr could continue speaking, but it no longer mattered. His interruptions were no longer demonstrations of dominance. They were admissions of fear. The narrative had shifted entirely, and everyone knew it. Dignity had triumphed. The chamber, once filled with tension, now brimmed with the weight of transformation. Crockett had not only defended herself, she had rewritten the script. What began as Barr's attempt to silence her had ended with her exposing him. And yet, as powerful as that moment was, it was only the beginning. Because while Crockett's words had landed like a thunderclap inside that room, the storm they unleashed outside would prove even more remarkable. But what happened after the cameras rolled might be the most shocking part of all. The line had barely left Jasmine Crockett's lips before the ripple began. In the hearing room it was silence. But outside, in the digital arena where reputations rise and crumble within hours, the explosion was immediate. Within minutes, clips of her 10th line takedown were everywhere. Twitter, now X, lit up like wildfire. Hashtags surged into the trending column. Crockett clapback, dignity over arrogance, Barr interrupted. Each tag became a rallying point, a digital campfire around which people gathered to relive, react, and rejoice. On TikTok, the moment was sliced, remixed, and replayed with music overlays. One clip slowed down the instant Barr's smirk faltered, setting it to a dramatic drumbeat. Another used freeze frames and flashing text. This is the exact second he realized he lost. In under 24 hours, those videos racked up millions of views, crossing generational and geographic lines. YouTube reaction channels jumped in, their thumbnails screaming with capital letters. CROCKETTNSBARR instantly. The reaction hosts leaned forward in disbelief, replaying the moment frame by frame, savoring the precision of her delivery. Even late-night comedians picked it up, weaving Crockett's words into monologues that had audiences roaring with laughter at Barr's expense. But it wasn't just about entertainment. Supporters seized the moment as proof of something larger. Activists, commentators, and ordinary citizens filled timelines with praise. That's how you handle arrogance. This is what representation looks like. She spoke for all of us who have ever been talked over. The pride was palpable, especially among communities who saw in Crockett's poise a reflection of their own struggles to be heard in rooms designed to silence them. Even neutral commentators, the kind who typically hedge every statement, couldn't deny what had happened. Pundits who prided themselves on balance admitted, sometimes with a chuckle, sometimes with awe, that Barr had been dismantled. Editorials described Crockett's composure as a masterclass in restraint and power, noting that her single sentence had done more damage to Barr's credibility than hours of cross-examination ever could. And then there was Barr himself. His silence in the aftermath became its own story. He had no sharp retort, no cutting comeback. The man who had spent an entire career dodging and deflecting was suddenly wordless, his trademark interruptions rendered impotent. That silence echoed louder than any defense he might have attempted. It told the public what words could not, that he had been caught off guard, exposed, and undone. The memes captured this truth mercilessly. Screenshots of Barr's stunned expression circulated with captions like, "When you realize interruptions can't save you." One viral post split-screened Crockett's calm face with Barr's bewildered one, adding the text, "Dignity 1, arrogance 0." But beneath the laughter, something more serious was brewing. Commentators began to note how rare it was for such a moment to break through the noise of partisan politics and resonate so widely. This wasn't just a soundbite, it was a cultural marker, the kind of exchange people would remember when they thought about dignity under fire. For those who had ever felt talked over in a classroom, a workplace, or even at their own dinner table, Crockett's victory felt personal. She hadn't just defended herself, she had defended them. Her poise, her calm, her precision became a shared triumph, proof that arrogance can be shattered not by shouting, but by truth delivered with courage. And the speed of the reaction ensured that Barr's narrative was not his own to control. By the time his aides could draft a statement or spin the press, the internet had already written the story. Crockett wasn't just victorious, she was iconic. Yet even as the laughter rolled, as the hashtag spread, as the applause grew louder, a deeper current was forming. Because beyond the memes and applause, something deeper was revealed. 9 times. That's how many times Bill Barr tried to cut Jasmine Crockett off, smirking with the same arrogance that had shielded him for decades. But on the 10th, everything changed. With a single line, Crockett ended the game he thought he controlled. The interruption stopped, the smirk faded, and the balance of power in that room shifted forever. What we witnessed wasn't just a sharp exchange. It was a collision between two forces: arrogance, loud and relentless, and dignity, quiet but unshakable. Barr believed that by talking over her, he could diminish her. Instead, he revealed her strength. He showed us how dignity doesn't need to shout, it only needs to speak once with truth, and the room will listen. This is why the moment matters. Not just because Crockett shut down a former attorney general, but because she embodied something bigger. The voices too often dismissed, interrupted, or silenced. She proved that patience is not weakness, that composure is not surrender. And when the right words arrive, they can cut through years of arrogance like lightning across the night sky. If you felt that spark, if you saw yourself in Crockett's calm resistance, then don't let this moment end here. Share this story. Subscribe so you don't miss the next battle where dignity stands against arrogance. And most of all, add your voice to the chorus that refuses to be silenced. Because these stories are not just about politics. They're about us, our struggles, our pride, our belief that truth still matters. And remember, in the end, it only takes one moment of truth to end 1,000 lies.